Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. Tonight, we'll travel to one of the most remote places on Earth, a world hidden beneath hundreds of meters of ice, where darkness is absolute, where the ocean hasn't seen sunlight in thousands of years. Antarctica. The continent holds secrets beneath its frozen surface. Vast ice shelves extend from the land out over the ocean. Some of these shelves are enormous, larger than entire countries, and beneath them lies something unexpected: life. Not just bacteria clinging to existence, complex creatures, thriving communities, a hidden ecosystem that challenges everything we thought we knew about where life can survive. The Ross Ice Shelf is one of the largest in Antarctica. It covers an area roughly the size of France. The ice above is thick. In some places, over 700 meters of solid ice separates the ocean below from the sky above. No light penetrates that barrier. The water beneath exists in perpetual darkness, the kind of darkness you can't quite imagine. Not the darkness of a moonless night, not the darkness of a cave. Something deeper, more complete. For decades, scientists assumed these waters were essentially lifeless, perhaps some microbes, maybe simple organisms eking out a minimal existence, but nothing more. The conditions seemed too extreme, too isolated. And by the way, where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to see where in the world you're listening from in the comments. Then in recent years, researchers began drilling through the ice, long, careful operations, lowering cameras and instruments down through boreholes, expecting to find cold, dark, empty water. What they discovered instead was astonishing. The first images came back showing something moving, then more movements, creatures swimming past the cameras, strange shapes on the seafloor, life existing in conditions that shouldn't support it. One expedition drilled through the ice shelf and lowered a camera nearly 600 meters down. The borehole was far from the edge of the ice shelf, far from any possible source of sunlight. The researchers expected barren rock and sediment. Instead, the camera revealed swarms of small crustaceans, amphipods similar to the tiny shrimp-like creatures you might find in any ocean. But these were living in complete darkness, under hundreds of meters of ice, in water that stays just below freezing year-round. The creatures weren't just surviving, they appeared healthy, active, moving with purpose through the frigid water. Then the camera panned across the sea floor, and there attached to a rock was something even more surprising: a stalked animal. Something resembling an anemone, or perhaps a primitive sponge, anchored to the bottom, filter feeding in the darkness. This discovery raised immediate questions. What were these creatures eating? In most ocean ecosystems, life depends ultimately on photosynthesis. Sunlight fuels algae and phytoplankton. Those organisms feed small animals. Those animals feed larger ones. The whole food web traces back to light. But here under the ice there is no light, no photosynthesis, no plants or algae producing food from the sun's energy. So where does the energy come from? The answer appears to lie in ocean currents. Water moves beneath the ice shelves. Slowly but constantly, currents flow in from the open ocean, carrying nutrients and organic matter, dead plankton, fragments of algae, tiny particles of biological material that drift in from the sunlit waters beyond the ice. This organic matter rains down through the water column, settles on the sea floor, and becomes food for the creatures living in the darkness. It's a kind of borrowed energy. Life beneath the ice depends on life from the distant sunlit ocean. The currents act as a conveyor belt, bringing sustenance from the world above into the perpetual night below. But even with this influx of nutrients, the ecosystem is remarkably sparse. Resources are limited. The water is extraordinarily cold. Metabolism slows to a crawl in these temperatures. Everything happens in slow motion. The creatures here grow slowly, reproduce slowly, live on the edge of what's energetically possible. Yet they persist, generation after generation, in conditions that seem impossibly harsh. Further exploration revealed even more diversity. Fish have been found beneath the ice, species adapted to the cold and darkness. Their bodies produce antifreeze proteins that prevent ice crystals from forming in their blood. Without these proteins, they would freeze solid in water this cold. Some of these fish are nearly transparent. In the darkness, there's no evolutionary pressure to develop pigmentation. No predators hunting by sight, no need for camouflage, so their bodies have lost most of their color. They drift through the black water like ghosts. Jellyfish have been spotted as well, delicate pulsing forms moving through the depths, their translucent bodies barely visible even in the camera lights. They capture prey using stinging cells, feeding on the amphipods and other small creatures that share this hidden world. The seafloor itself hosts communities of strange organisms. Sponges and sea anemones anchor themselves to rocks. Worms burrow through the sediment. Starfish creep slowly across the bottom, searching for food. Each of these creatures has adapted to life without light. Their metabolisms are tuned to extreme cold. Their life cycles stretched out over years or even decades. Everything about them reflects the unique demands of this environment. What makes this discovery particularly fascinating is how recently we learnt about it. These ecosystems have existed for thousands of years, possibly much longer. Entire communities of organisms living and dying in the darkness. And we had no idea they were there. The ice above has been their ceiling for millennia, isolating them from the surface world, creating a separate realm, a place where the rules are different, where life finds ways to persist that we're only beginning to understand. There's something humbling about it. We've mapped the surface of Mars in extraordinary detail. We've sent probes to the outer solar system. Yet here on Earth, vast ecosystems remained completely unknown to us, hidden beneath the ice, waiting to be discovered. And the more we explore, the more we find. Each expedition beneath the ice shelves reveals new species, new adaptations, new ways that life manages to survive in conditions we once thought were uninhabitable. The creatures living there know nothing of the sun. They've never experienced light. For them, darkness is the entire universe. The cold water, the slow currents, the occasional rain of organic matter from above. That's their complete reality. In a way, they're living in a world disconnected from the rest of the planet. The ice above creates a barrier, not just physical but temporal. The water beneath the ice shelves can take centuries to fully exchange with the open ocean. Some of the water these creatures swim through may have been isolated for longer than human civilization has existed. This raises intriguing questions about evolution. How do these populations change over time? Are they evolving separately from their relatives in the open ocean? Are new species emerging in the darkness? The isolation could be driving unique evolutionary paths, creating biodiversity we're only beginning to document. But there's also a fragility to these ecosystems. They depend on the ice above remaining stable, on the currents continuing to flow, on the delicate balance of nutrients coming in and waste going out, and that ice is changing. Antarctica is warming, not everywhere at the same rate, but in certain regions the change is measurable. Ice shelves that have existed for thousands of years are thinning. Some are breaking apart. When an ice shelf collapses, the ecosystem beneath it is suddenly exposed. The darkness ends. Light floods in. The temperature changes. The currents shift. Everything that made that environment unique vanishes in a matter of weeks or months. The creatures adapted to perpetual darkness have nowhere to go. They can't migrate to another ice shelf. The distances are too vast. The open ocean is too different, too warm, too bright, too full of predators they've never encountered. So when the ice goes, the ecosystem beneath it likely goes as well. Entire communities of organisms, species that may exist nowhere else, gone before we've had a chance to fully study them, before we've even catalogued what lives there. Scientists are racing to document these ecosystems while they still exist. Each expedition is an opportunity to capture a snapshot of life beneath the ice, to collect samples, to record what's there, to understand how these systems function before they disappear. But it's challenging work. The ice shelves are remote, difficult to reach. Drilling through hundreds of meters of ice requires specialized equipment, heavy machinery that must be transported across the frozen landscape, generators to power the drills, supplies to sustain a team in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Once through the ice, the exploration must happen quickly. The borehole begins to freeze over almost immediately. The water is so cold that ice forms rapidly. Teams have limited time to lower cameras and sampling equipment to capture what they can before the hole closes. And even when successful, they're only seeing a tiny fraction of what's down there. The borehole is narrow. The cameras illuminate only a small area. The vastness of the sub-ice ocean remains largely unexplored, mostly unknown. An entire ocean exists beneath the Antarctic ice, larger than many countries. Deeper than skyscrapers are tall, and we've examined only the tiniest portions of it. A few boreholes, a few camera deployments. Brief glimpses into a world that stretches for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. What else might be living down there? What other adaptations have evolved in the darkness? What relationships exist between species that we haven't yet observed? The sub-ice realm could be hosting ecosystems more diverse than we currently imagine. Creatures we haven't seen, behaviors we haven't documented, entire food webs we don't yet understand. Some researchers suspect there may be specialized microenvironments beneath the ice, places where conditions are slightly different, perhaps near where the ice shelf grounds on underwater mountains, or in areas where the currents create unique patterns. Each of these microenvironments could support distinct communities of life. There's also the question of how these ecosystems first formed. When did life colonize the waters beneath the ice shelves? Did it happen gradually as the ice expanded? Or were there always pockets of life that became trapped as the ice grew overhead? The ice shelves themselves are ancient. Some have existed for tens of thousands of years. Others formed more recently. But in either case, life found a way to persist beneath them, to adapt to the darkness and cold, to build functioning ecosystems in conditions that seem utterly hostile. And now we're discovering that these hidden worlds are far more complex than anyone expected. Not barren, not empty, but teeming with life in their own quiet way. The Antarctic ice holds secrets we're only beginning to uncover. Some of those secrets challenge our understanding of where life can exist at all. Beneath certain ice shelves, researchers have found something unexpected. Not just simple organisms clinging to survival, complex ecosystems with multiple layers of interaction. Predators and prey, scavengers and filter feeders, entire food webs functioning in complete isolation from the sun. One discovery stands out. In 2021, a team drilling through the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf lowered a camera nearly 900 meters down. They expected perhaps a few simple creatures, maybe some bacteria. Instead, the camera revealed a thriving community. Sponges attached to rocks on the seafloor, anemones swaying in the gentle current, small fish-like creatures darting past the lens. All of this happening in water that hadn't seen sunlight in potentially thousands of years. The sponges were particularly surprising. These aren't simple organisms. They're filter feeders that require a steady supply of nutrients flowing past them. They build complex structures. Some grow quite large, and they were thriving down there in the darkness. This raises a fundamental question. What are they eating? The answer appears to be a combination of things. Organic matter drifts down from above. Algae and plankton that die in the open ocean get carried by currents under the ice. Some of this material settles on the seafloor, becomes food for bottom-dwelling creatures. But there's also chemistry happening. The ice itself contains trapped air bubbles, ancient atmosphere frozen in place. As the ice slowly melts at its base, these bubbles release gases. Some of those gases can be used by bacteria, chemosynthesis, life powered not by sunlight, but by chemical reactions. These bacteria form the foundation of the food web. They convert chemicals into energy, build their bodies from the raw materials in the water. Then other creatures eat the bacteria, and larger creatures eat those. A chain of life built on chemistry instead of photosynthesis. It's similar to what happens around deep-sea hydrothermal vents, those underwater hot springs where superheated water rich in minerals pours out of cracks in the ocean floor. Communities of life cluster around the vents, tube worms and crabs and fish, all depending on bacteria that harvest energy from the chemicals in the hot water. The sub-ice ecosystems work on a similar principle, just much colder, much slower. But the fundamental idea is the same, life finding energy in chemistry when light isn't available. What's remarkable is the diversity. These aren't just bacterial mats covering rocks. There are animals with complex behaviors, creatures that hunt, that reproduce, that compete for space and resources. Some of the organisms found beneath the ice don't match anything in existing databases. They may be new species, or they may be known species that have adapted so thoroughly to the sub-ice environment that they look different from their relatives in the open ocean. The isolation has likely driven significant evolutionary changes. Populations separated for thousands of years evolve independently, Mutations accumulate, new traits emerge. Over time, the isolated population becomes distinct. Eventually, it may become a separate species entirely. This process is happening right now beneath the Antarctic ice, evolution in slow motion, creating biodiversity in one of the most extreme environments on the planet. But studying these ecosystems is extraordinarily difficult. Each borehole costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to drill, requires months of planning, weeks of work in brutal conditions, and provides only a narrow window into the world below. The researchers must work fast. The borehole freezes rapidly. Ice crystals form in the water. The opening narrows. Within hours, it may become too small to retrieve equipment. Within days, it can close completely. So the team lowers cameras and sensors as quickly as possible, captures video, takes water samples, collects any organisms they can reach, then pulls everything back up before the ice reclaims the hole. The footage they retrieve is often grainy. The cameras struggle in the darkness. The water contains particles that scatter light, and the organisms themselves are sometimes hard to see. Translucent bodies, slow movements, creatures adapted to a world where visibility doesn't matter. But even these brief glimpses reveal astonishing complexity. One video showed what appeared to be a small crustacean farming bacteria on a rock surface, tending a patch of microbial growth, harvesting it periodically, behavior that suggests a level of sophistication researchers didn't expect to find. Another borehole revealed tracks on the seafloor, trails left by something moving across the sediment. The creature itself wasn't visible, but the tracks indicated it was relatively large, perhaps the size of a hand, moving in deliberate patterns, searching for food or exploring its territory. These observations hint at a world far richer than the limited footage can capture. The cameras see only what immediately in front of them, a few meters at most, but the ocean beneath the ice stretches in all directions, vast and largely unexplored. There could be larger creatures out there, things that avoid the light from the cameras, or that live in areas we haven't yet accessed. The sub-ice ocean is enormous, and we've sampled such a tiny fraction of it. Some researchers have proposed using autonomous underwater vehicles, small submarines that could be lowered through a borehole and then navigate on their own beneath the ice, mapping larger areas, recording more data, exploring regions too far from the borehole for tethered cameras to reach. But the technology is still developing. The vehicles need to operate in near-freezing water, navigate in complete darkness, avoid getting trapped under ice formations, and return to the borehole to be retrieved. It's a challenging set of requirements. A few experimental deployments have been attempted. The results were mixed. One vehicle successfully mapped several hundred meters of seafloor, sent back valuable data. Another got stuck under an ice ridge, lost contact, never recovered. The risks are high, the equipment is expensive, but the potential rewards are significant. Understanding these ecosystems could teach us about the limits of life, about how organisms adapt to extreme isolation, about what's possible in environments we once thought were sterile. And there's another reason to study these systems. They may be analogues for life elsewhere in the solar system. Several moons orbiting Jupiter and Saturn are covered in ice. Beneath that ice, scientists believe there are oceans, liquid water kept from freezing by tidal forces and internal heat. Europa, Enceladus, possibly others. These moons have never been warm enough for surface oceans. The ice has likely been there for billions of years. But underneath, there could be water, and where there's water, there might be life. The sub-ice ecosystems of Antarctica give us a model for what that life might look like, how it might function, what it might need to survive. Studying life beneath Earth's ice shelves helps us understand what to look for when we eventually send probes to explore those distant moons. The discoveries beneath Antarctic ice are teaching us that life is more resilient than we imagined, more creative, more capable of finding ways to persist in conditions that seem impossible. And we're only just beginning to understand what's down there. The ice shelves of Antarctica aren't uniform. Some areas are relatively thin, a few hundred meters of ice separating the ocean from the surface. Others are massive, over a kilometer thick in places. Ancient ice compressed over millennia. The thickness matters. It determines how much pressure the water below experiences, how stable the environment remains, how isolated the ecosystem becomes. Under thinner ice, there's more exchange with the surrounding ocean. Currents can flow more easily beneath the shelf, bringing nutrients, carrying organisms, connecting the sub-ice world to the broader Antarctic marine ecosystem. But under the thickest ice, isolation is nearly complete. The water moves slowly. Exchange with the open ocean happens over years or decades rather than days. The organisms living there may have been cut off from the rest of the world for generations. This creates something like evolutionary islands, populations that diverge from their relatives in the open ocean, adapting to the specific conditions of their particular sub-ice environment, developing unique traits, becoming distinct. Some researchers have found genetic differences in organisms collected from different ice shelves, the same species, but with variations that suggest long periods of separation, populations evolving independently, following slightly different paths. One study examined amphipods from 3 different sub-ice locations, small crustaceans common in Antarctic waters. The populations looked similar, but genetic analysis revealed they'd been isolated from each other for thousands of years, each group carrying mutations the others didn't have. This genetic divergence tells us something important. These ecosystems aren't temporary, they're not recent developments. Life has been persisting beneath the ice for a very long time. The ice itself has a history. It advances and retreats over geological timescales. During ice ages, the shelves grow larger, extending farther out to sea. During warmer periods, they shrink, retreating back toward land. Each advance traps new areas of ocean beneath the ice. Each retreat exposes previously covered seafloor. The organisms living there must adapt to these changes, or migrate, or die. The ones we find today are the descendants of populations that survived these cycles, species that managed to persist through advances and retreats, through periods of greater and lesser isolation, through changing conditions over thousands of years. Their survival suggests remarkable flexibility, the ability to endure both the stable darkness of full ice cover and the disruption of ice retreat, to find food in changing conditions, to reproduce even when populations become fragmented. Some species may have refuges, areas where conditions remain relatively stable even as the ice shifts, deep channels that stay covered, regions where currents continue to flow, places where life can persist through the transitions. Others might have life cycles adapted to instability, dormant stages that can survive harsh periods, rapid reproduction when conditions improve, strategies for colonizing newly accessible areas quickly. The details are still being worked out, but the evidence points to ecosystems with deep histories, communities that have weathered dramatic environmental changes, life that has found ways to endure in one of Earth's most challenging environments, and the ice continues to change, right now, in ways that will reshape these hidden worlds. Antarctica is warming. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but in certain regions, the change is measurable. The Antarctic Peninsula has warmed faster than almost anywhere else on Earth over the past 50 years. Ice shelves stable for millennia are beginning to thin. This warming affects the hidden ecosystems beneath the ice in complex ways. When ice shelves thin, more light can potentially penetrate. The barrier between surface and ocean becomes less absolute. Organisms adapted to complete darkness might encounter conditions they haven't experienced in generations. But light isn't the only change. Thinning ice means less weight pressing down on the water below, less pressure, subtle shifts in water circulation, changes in how currents flow beneath the shelf. The stable environment these organisms depend on begins to shift. Some ice shelves are collapsing entirely, breaking apart, sending massive icebergs drifting into the Southern Ocean. When this happens, seafloor that was covered for thousands of years suddenly becomes exposed, open to sunlight for the first time in recorded history. In 2002, the Larsen B ice shelf collapsed. An area roughly the size of Rhode Island disintegrated in just a few weeks. Scientists rushed to study the newly exposed seafloor before it changed too dramatically. What they found was unexpected. The seafloor wasn't barren. Life was there, but it looked different from typical Antarctic seafloor communities. The species composition was unusual. Certain organisms were far more abundant than expected. Others were missing entirely. Glass sponges dominated some areas, tall, delicate structures rising from the mud. These sponges grow incredibly slowly. Some of the individuals found were likely hundreds of years old. They'd been living in darkness beneath the ice for their entire lives. There were also brittle stars, relatives of starfish with long, thin arms. They covered the seafloor in dense aggregations, thousands of individuals in small areas, their arms waving slowly in the current, filtering particles from the water. But certain species common in open Antarctic waters were absent. Fast-growing algae, mobile predators that rely on visual hunting, organisms that need more food than the sub-ice environment could provide. The community was adapted to scarcity, to darkness, to isolation, and now it was exposed. Within months, the seafloor began to change. Algae started to grow, photosynthetic organisms taking advantage of the sudden availability of light. Species from surrounding areas moved in, colonizing the newly accessible habitat. The sub-ice community didn't disappear immediately, but it was no longer isolated, no longer protected. The conditions that had shaped it for thousands of years were gone. This process is happening in multiple locations. As ice shelves thin and retreat, more seafloor gets exposed, more sub-ice ecosystems transition into open water environments. The hidden worlds are becoming visible. For scientists, this creates both opportunity and urgency. The opportunity is access. Areas that were impossible to study are now reachable. Seafloor communities that required drilling or robotic submarines can now be visited by divers, observed directly, sampled more easily. But there's urgency too. These ecosystems are changing rapidly. The window to study them in their isolated state is closing. Within a few years of exposure, the communities shift. The unique adaptations to sub-ice life become less visible. The ecosystems start to resemble typical Antarctic seafloor habitats. Some researchers are racing to document as many sub-ice communities as possible before they transform, collecting organisms, recording species compositions, measuring genetic diversity, trying to understand what these ecosystems looked like before the ice retreated. Others are studying the transition itself, watching how communities change when exposed, which species persist, which disappear, how quickly new organisms colonize, what the final community looks like after the transition completes. One team has been monitoring a section of seafloor exposed when an ice shelf partially collapsed in 2017. They return every year, photographing the same areas, tracking changes over time. In the first year, the seafloor looked much as it had under the ice. Sparse, dominated by filter feeders and scavengers, very little algae. By the second year, patches of algae had appeared, small at first, but growing, photosynthesizing, producing oxygen, changing the chemistry of the water near the seafloor. By the third year, the algae had spread significantly, and with it came new species, small crustaceans that graze on algae, fish that hadn't been seen in the area before, mobile predators, taking advantage of the increased food availability. The original sub-ice species were still present, but they were becoming less dominant. The ecosystem was shifting towards something more typical of open Antarctic waters. This transformation tells us something important about these hidden communities. They're resilient in their own environment, adapted to persist in extreme isolation, but they're not necessarily competitive when that isolation ends. The organisms that thrive in darkness and scarcity often can't compete with species adapted to light and abundance. When the barrier between environments is removed, the sub-ice specialists get outcompeted, replaced by generalists that can exploit the new conditions more effectively. Some sub-ice species may disappear entirely as ice shelves retreat, losing their habitat, unable to find refuge elsewhere. Others might persist in the few remaining isolated areas, pockets of darkness beneath the thickest ice, regions where retreat hasn't yet reached. The genetic diversity being lost is significant. Populations that diverged over thousands of years, unique adaptations that took generations to develop, all of it potentially vanishing as the ice changes. This raises difficult questions about conservation. How do you protect an ecosystem that exists beneath ice? How do you preserve communities that are inaccessible and largely unknown? There are no easy answers. The ice shelves are responding to global climate patterns, processes far larger than any local conservation effort. The retreat is likely to continue. The hidden worlds will keep being exposed. But understanding what's being lost matters. Documenting these ecosystems, learning how they function, recognizing their value. Even if the changes can't be stopped, at least they can be witnessed. What existed can be recorded. What made these communities unique can be understood. And there's still much we don't know. Many ice shelves remain intact, thick enough, stable enough. For now, beneath them, ecosystems continue in darkness, unchanged, isolated, carrying on as they have for millennia. These remaining sub-ice worlds represent our best chance to understand what Antarctica's hidden ecosystems looked like before warming began, before the retreat started, when isolation was complete and darkness was permanent. Exploring them requires careful planning, the right equipment, the right conditions, and increasingly, a sense of urgency, because the ice shelves won't stay frozen forever. The technology for accessing these environments keeps improving. ROVs become more sophisticated. Cameras capture higher resolution images. Sampling equipment gets more precise, but the fundamental challenge remains: getting beneath kilometers of ice, into water that's been sealed off from the surface for thousands of years. Some research teams drill through the ice shelf itself, creating narrow boreholes, lowering instruments down into the cavity below. It's painstaking work. The drilling can take weeks. The borehole might only stay open for hours before it starts to freeze closed again. Through these narrow windows, researchers glimpse the world below. Cameras record what they can. Sensors measure temperature, salinity, oxygen levels. Sometimes they collect water samples, filtering out any organisms suspended in the flow. What they find keeps surprising them. In 2021, a team drilling through the Filchner Ronne ice shelf lowered a camera nearly 900 meters down. They expected to film the seafloor, maybe see some sparse life. What they recorded instead was a boulder covered in attached organisms, sponges, stalked creatures that looked almost like flowers, all of them anchored to rock, all of them thriving in complete darkness. The boulder itself was puzzling. How did it get there? Ice shelves float. The seafloor beneath them is typically soft sediment, dropped from above over millennia. Finding a large rock in this environment suggests a more complex history, perhaps carried by icebergs long ago, deposited when the ice shelf was thinner or absent entirely.